All right, in this segment, we're going to do a really quick overview of the style periods of music. So what do we mean when we talk about style? You know about style in clothes, styles of houses, styles of furniture. We have styles in the arts as well. We're going to be talking about those in much more detail as the course goes along. So today we're just going to get a kind of a quick preview of what each period is like. And we're going to use visual art to help us with that. So we're going to start with the old stuff. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the music from way back because, as I've said before, you're not going to hear it in concerts. It's something you're just not going to encounter very much. But you need to get a sense of what was happening in the world and why that music had a place in the world at that time. So we're going to use a painting of the Nativity with the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, which was painted in the 1300s. So we're talking about even before the Renaissance. We have lots of names for periods before that in visual art and music. I just like to call it early music. Anything before the Renaissance, early music. I don't need any more detail than that. So if we're looking at this period of time in terms of the visual arts, and what I've chosen to do with this is to take a series of portraits so that we have the same kind of painting throughout periods, pictures of people, and you can see how things change over time. So in this painting, we see Isaiah and Ezekiel, who are on either side, flanking the central section here. And in the middle, we have your basic nativity scene. Mary, the baby Jesus, some animals, and a little manger, the whole sort of thing you would expect from a nativity scene. Lots of the art that we see from this period is religious in nature. This is a period of time where most people couldn't read. We didn't have printed words yet. If you were going to read something, it was written by hand, and only rich people could get it. So paintings were a way of teaching people. So we see lots of paintings of religious topics because they were used to instruct people about the Bible. They could hear the stories at church, they could go look at these paintings, and they could recreate the stories for themselves. So that's what we have in this particular painting. As we look at the painting, we can see that the two men on either side are pretty much full size, but then in the middle we have this crowd of people, and they're tiny. And some of them look like they're sitting on top of the stable. And that's pretty typical of artwork from this period of time because they hadn't quite figured out how to do that whole vanishing perspective thing that we'll see coming along in about 100 years or so. So we see paintings in this period of time where it looks like, one of my favorites is a painting of Jesus on the Mount, and there's a sheep in the front. But it looks like Jesus is standing on the sheep's head because the sheep is so out of proportion with the whole picture. So like this giant Jesus, this little sheep underneath his feet, but he's really supposed to be on the mountain. So if you see paintings that look like they didn't quite know what they were doing in terms of perspective, it's probably from before 1400. In music, we have a similar sort of thing. We have music that doesn't have much depth to it in terms of multiple layers of things. We have Gregorian chant. We have maybe a couple of line things, but mostly it's chant and not very complex types of music. So, as I said, we're not going to spend much time there. So we're going to move on now to the Renaissance. Renaissance is a big period of time, very important in terms of lots of things. The Renaissance means rebirth. Up to this time, it's been the world's been a tough place. Lots of wars, plagues, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, pick whichever horrible thing you want to pick, has come through. The Renaissance comes along, and we are trying to learn more about our world. And the world has not been good to us so far, so we would kind of like to be happier in it. If you look at literature and lots of things before this period of time, the focus is really on, if we can just survive the world today, when we die, we'll have this great afterlife. So really the focus was on getting through this time so that we could have our great afterlife later. When we get to the Renaissance, we see that shift, and we're going to see this shifting back and forth throughout all the time periods. Get to the Renaissance, and they're saying, why don't we focus on what's happening to us now in our daily lives? Let's learn about our daily lives. Let's explore. So it's more of a focus on now, not that they've given up on religion, not that they don't believe in the afterlife anymore, but they want to make the most of the life that we have here on earth while we're at it. So we have a painting here. Again, it's a religious painting because that's still very important. But this one's called The Rest on the Flight into Egypt, and this was painted in the 1500s. So we contrast that to the painting we saw before. Mary in this painting looks like she's a normal person. She doesn't even have a halo on her head. In most paintings before that, you'll see they have a halo because then we know it's a saint. So she's sitting here on a rock. She's got the baby in her lap. It's a very accessible kind of picture. You think, oh, I'm just walking past and I happen to see this woman sitting here on a rock, and it's just a very pleasant kind of thing. It doesn't look nearly as holy, for lack of a better word, as the other one did. It puts Mary into a more human context, and that was really what the Renaissance period was about, just making things more human and at a level that we could understand. So the Renaissance is from about 1450 to 1600, fairly long period of time. A lot of famous people from that period, and we will talk about them in more detail when we look at the period in depth. So let's move to the next period. Now, I guess I should tell you about music of that period before we move on. Music in the Renaissance, we are starting to see more texture, more depth in the music. We see that we take Gregorian chant and use it as the basis for other kinds of music. The madrigal starts coming through in this period of time. We have troubadours who wander from town to town and sing for people. So we're getting a little bit more breadth of kinds of music in this period of time, not so much focus on religious music. Right after the Renaissance, we had the Baroque, which starts at around 1600 and lasts until about 1750. So I guess it would be important to say that we didn't get up on January 1st, 1600 and say, hey, I think it's the Baroque today. All these designations have been put on long after the periods have gone by. The whole idea of historic titling is really something that comes about in the 19th century. So it's not like people in the Baroque period thought of themselves as being in the Baroque. They didn't have any idea what that was. But we've gone back and applied these terms retrospectively. So 1750 is an interesting end date for the Baroque because that's the year that Bach died. And Bach is the big composer name for the Baroque period. So it was significant enough to make that the sort of, we're done with the Baroque in 1750. So in the Baroque period, the name Baroque means an irregular plural, and at the time they applied it to this period, they were really kind of being derogatory about what was happening in the period. As we'll see when we look at the period in more depth, we'll see that they just put gold on everything. If there was a surface that you could gild, it's gilded. Lots of fancy frou-frous and stuff, and it really is sort of tacky, if some of it can be. Some of it's absolutely beautiful, but some of you just go, really, what were you thinking? And that's sort of how the people who put the titles on went, what were you thinking there? But not everything in the Baroque period is that way. As we see looking at our painting here, which is called The Suitor's Visit. We're actually going to look at two paintings from the Baroque period because it's kind of an interesting view of Baroque thinking. So in this painting, we have a woman who's very nicely dressed, and there's a gentleman who's coming in the door and bowing to her, so obviously he's greeting her. And in the background, we have a person playing a musical instrument, and then there's a guy in the back warming his hands by the fire. So the title, The Suitor's Visit, you'd think, okay, this is her fiance or a man who's interested in her or something like that. Well, it's true, this man is interested in her, but not in the way you think. He's actually paying for her services. And the fact that there's a musician there, I think, is supposed to tell us that this is more of a business proposition than a personal kind of proposition. There's also a dog in the painting. We see dogs in paintings quite a lot. And dogs have two meanings. One is that they are a symbol of loyalty. The other is that they're a symbol of bestiality. So two extremes. And in this case, he's taking the bad side of it. So he's coming in with the man. He's not the woman's dog. You can see that he's come in with the man. And he's sort of indicating to us that this is not what we would consider a proper kind of interaction. But it's a picture that people would have understood at the period of time that we're talking about. And they would actually have probably been amused by that. It'd be like us watching Sex and the City or something. It's got a saucy little story right here in our painting. So let's compare that to this next painting, which has a very similar looking topic. It's called The Intruder. So in the first case, we had a painting that said The Suitor, which makes us think good things about this man. In this painting, we have The Intruder, which makes us think perhaps this is not a good person. But really, in this case, the intruder is the woman's fiance, about to be her husbend. And the deal was that if you were supposed to sort of like declare your want for this woman by sort of stealing her away from her family. It's a figurative kind of thing. So we have the same woman. We have a woman. She's dressed very similarly. She's got on a white skirt and a colored blouse. There's a dog in the painting again. This time the dog is on her side. So that dog tells us that this is loyalty, that this is a good thing. There's a woman sort of pretending to hold back the guy. And it's all sort of a farce about this relationship, which is really what would be considered a proper relationship. So we have two very different views of life, but they're views of real life. This is not Mary and Jesus. These are real people. And that's something that's relatively new in the Baroque period. You just don't see people that are, somebody might know in paintings before that period of time. And they're not posed either. This is not like you just see her standing there looking very formal like we think about portraits. It's sort of an action photo, and that's very typical of the Baroque period. And there's lots of action in the music of the Baroque period too. This is the time that we start to see opera, which is of course highly dramatic. It's the perfect place to tell these sorts of stories. So we'll see more of that as we look at that. All right, after the Baroque period, we have one of the very short periods of music history, which is the classical period. Remember I told you that most people who don't know about music call everything that's art music classical music. It really applies to a very specific period of time, and that is from 1750 to about 1820. The big composers of the time, Mozart and Haydn, and early Beethoven. So their names very important. Short period, lots of music. So in the arts, we call it classical because what they were thinking was, hey, let's go back. Remember, we're starting to study history. Let's go back and look at ancient Rome, ancient Greece. We're learning about some of those cultures, and let's try to incorporate that into our artworks. If you go to Washington, D.C., or any big city with lots of public buildings, you will see the classical period in the architecture. Very structured, lots of granite and marble, which are, of course, if you think Roman ruins, it's all big stone stuff. If you look at all those buildings, they're made of marble, they have columns, they're often in a very balanced kind of shape. So if you think about a building like the U.S. Capitol building or the White House, here's a little section, here's a little section, they balance each other. In the middle you have a dome. You can see that structure all over the place, all over the country, all over the world. If it looks like that, chances are it's part of the classical period, or it's something the classical period was modeling on. They wanted that clean, crisp kind of look. We think about the period before where everything was all decorated up. You can only stand that sensory overload for so long. You want to swing back the other way. So we swing back to a very reserved, less emotional, cleaner kind of look in architecture, in painting, cleaner kind of sound in music. So the painting that we're looking at is of George Washington's family. So we have a family portrait here. But you think of George Washington, you always think that painting that everybody knows, the Gilbert Stuart, that's sort of the famous George Washington painting. But in this painting, we have George and Martha and two of their children, and they're sitting around a table. So, all right, family portrait, no big deal, right? But if we look in the background of this painting, we can see that there's kind of a curtain in the back. If you look at paintings from this period, you will find lots of portraits where there's some sort of big drape in the back, maybe a column of some sort, so we get that Roman or Greek column in the picture, and then if you look, it's like they're looking out a big window or off a big balcony, and you can see some sort of lovely scenery in the background. The chances of George Washington's family having had a room like that are pretty slim. But that's the way that they set the paintings up. Put this nice sort of royal-looking curtain thing, put a column, make everything look very formal and orderly. As you look at the picture in more detail, you see that we have suggestions of the importance of George Washington. There's a big map on the table, so we would assume that's a map of the United States, showing that he is the president and the leader of all this. There's a map, there's a globe of the world there, so it sort of puts Washington into his place in the world. In the background, strangely, there is what looks like some sort of African wearing a very wild outfit. Where that comes from, I'm pretty sure even if George Washington's slaves were in the room, they weren't dressed quite as elegantly as that. So we've got the same idea. We got a family portrait. These are real people, famous people, in fact, but we've posed them in a way. This is obviously not a normal sort of setting for the family. They wouldn't all be sitting around the family table looking at a map, for starters. I doubt that Martha and George sat around and looked at maps of the United States very much. But it was a way of indicating to the audience who this person is, their importance in the world. There's a very famous painting of Napoleon that has similar kinds of things. He's got a map lying on the ground of France, and he's got his symbol of office. And so they put in all these little things to tell you who this person is and that they're a person of rank. We don't see many paintings of, just people who buying pictures of themselves at this time. You had to have money to get your portrait painted, so it's really usually well-off people, important political people, things like that. So the classical period, this is, we have opera still. Opera does not go away. Mozart wrote lots of operas, and they're wonderful, and you're going to hopefully get to see some of that as we go along. But the symphony is really starting to be an important element here, and the piano is coming along. So much more structured kinds of pieces. The symphony, the genre, the symphony is developed in this period of time, which is very structured, really fits that classical model. All right, after the classical period, we have another fairly short period, and that's called the Romantic period. Starts around 1820. Usually we say it ends around 1900. Some people would put that date at 1914, which is the beginning of the First World War, because obviously that is a massive change in social structure at that point. Not that there weren't plenty of wars before that time, but that was a major historic breaking point. So some people would put it to 1914, but generally we say 1900. So we call it the Romantic period. We're not talking about Valentines and flowers and love and all that sort of stuff. It's more romantic in the sense of being very emotional, having a breadth of emotion. We talk about the Romance languages, and those are not about hearts and flowers either. So it kind of comes from the same root. So we see in opera some very dramatic stories. I think most of the famous operas, come from the Romantic period. Carmen, we've got this woman who works in a cigarette factory who has relationships with soldiers. She has a relationship with a bullfighter. In the end, there's dead people all over the place. It's highly charged, real people, even in terms of people you might know. If you lived in Spain in the 1800s, you might have known a woman who worked at a cigarette factory. Chances of your having known a count or a countess, which would have been a character in a classical period opera, would be very slim. 19th century opera, we see real kinds of people in the stories. We see instrumental music that's trying to tell us a story. So we have pieces like Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, which is not a play. It doesn't go with the play. It's not a ballet. It's an instrumental work that tells the story of Romeo and Juliet through the music. So Romeo has a theme and Juliet has a theme, and the priest has a theme, and you can hear sword fighting in it, and it's all really dramatic and emotional. We had that in the Baroque period too, but in the Baroque period the emotions would have been restrained, relatively speaking, and we would basically kind of focus on one emotion at a time. In the Romantic period, within a 5-minute piece, you might have a dramatic range of emotions from very calm and sort of loving to violent. And that's the sense of romance that we're talking about when we talk about the Romantic period. So the painting that we're looking at is by Eugene Delacroix, who's a French painter. And for him, this is a pretty calm painting. He's really well known for paintings of battle scenes. He did some paintings like in Morocco when the Arabs were fighting each other, where horses are sort of flailing around and bodies are flying, dead animals on the ground. That's sort of his claim to fame. But this is a very different style for him. This painting is of Christopher Columbus and his son. And they are waiting at a monastery for Queen Isabella to say, I'm going to give you the money to go make your big trip. So it's very kind of restrained looking for the Romantic period. We have these lovely arches, which sort of carries us over from the classical period, and in a monastery you would expect that. On the wall, there's a map of the world. So we're knowing, okay, here's Christopher Columbus. We know in hindsight, that he's going off to discover the New World, quote, discover. This is painted in 1838. They already knew about Christopher Columbus. So he's looking at his map. His son's sitting on the bench. He looks like he's gone to sleep, which you would expect a kid to do while he's just waiting around in a monastery where there's nothing happening. And Christopher Columbus is just sort of looking at the map pensively, like, just if I can just get the money, I can do this. And then you have these other characters in the picture that are just sort of watching and waiting with him. So you can make your own story right out of this painting. Fairly simple, but you know, if you know the background, and remember the 19th century was a period of time when we started looking at history and seeing what had happened in the past and learning more about it. So this would fit right in with that romantic ideal of studying the past, representing it, bringing it into the future. So it's a kind of a portrait, but it's very different from George Washington's very classically posed kind of portrait. Here's a portrait that's much more intimate, which is also characteristic of the Romantic period. All right, so let's get now to the final period that we'll be talking about this during this course, and that is what we, for now, call the modern period. As I said, we give all these periods names after the fact, so we're not there yet. We haven't got far enough past this time period to give it a name. The 20th century has been an incredibly diverse period of time in terms of all the arts. We have gone from the early period having been a very romantic kind of style. We've had some really weird things happen in like the 20s and 30s where people were trying to be completely out of a key, completely unstructured. We have had a lot of emphasis on music that represents your culture, so Americana and that sort of thing. We've had electronic music, and we've invented the radio, the wax cylinder, the LP, 8-track tapes, CDs, cassettes, it just changes so fast. And the music and the art changes in much the same way. So we really haven't got a good name for it yet. We just call it the modern period. And that's the period that we're in now. So music is all over the place, as we'll see when we get to that. Even in art music, it's like popular music. There's so many different styles and so many different things going, it's hard to keep up with. But the painting that we're going to look at from this period is called Daybreak, A Time to Rest. This was painted in 1967. So this is a portrait, but if you look at it, you'd think, really? Portrait? Because the first thing that strikes you is feet. It's a portrait of someone who is on their passage through the Underground Railroad. So this is the topic is earlier, but it's depicting a slave who is trying to get to freedom, and you sleep where you can. So the painting is done from the perspective, like I'm down here looking at your feet while you're asleep. So I'm looking at you lying on the sand that way. So mostly what you see is feet, and the person's head and arms and everything is sort of back there somewhere. Which really puts an emphasis on the idea that the feet are what's getting you where you're going. It's not the rest of you. So it's a really interesting perspective. We'll see those kinds of interesting perspectives in music, as well as art, literature, all sorts of different things in the 20th century. So that's our quick little trip through all the periods of music. As we go through the rest of the course, we'll look at each of those in much more detail and break them down into smaller bits. But for right now, at least you have a general view of what the musical styles are and how art can represent that over time.